Hello, everyone. Welcome to Ancient and Modern. Today, my wonderful guest is Dr. or Professor Xavier Marquez, who's a colleague of mine at Victoria University of Wellington, and he's someone whose interests span both the ancient world and the modern, political science, political theory, authoritarianism, democracy, and an interest in R as well, statistics. You seem to do everything, Xavier. But one of the things I wanted to start out with, actually, because this is a podcast devoted to ancient and modern, is your book, A Stranger's Knowledge, Statesmanship, Philosophy, and Law in Plato's Statesman, which I highly recommend to people. I mean, it's a work of Platonic exegesis, the interpretation of what Plato is trying to do with this dialogue, but you also sort of use it as a platform to talk about issues about expertise and knowledge, what knowledge is, what political knowledge is, the alternatives to a system which is based on expertise, the potentialities of a system which is based on a particular conception of expertise, and lots of other things. So I'm kind of speaking for you. So why don't I just back up? I just want to ask you, first of all, why did you write a book about the statesman? Because it's often seen, I think, as a little bit, not maybe Plato's greatest triumph, and maybe not the most readable work. So why did you go for that one?
Yeah, it's certainly not the most readable work, but honestly, with Plato, like greater acquaintance breeds like more interest. And my initial plan was to write a dissertation. This originated in my PhD dissertation. My initial plan was to write a dissertation about the strangers in Plato, sort of look at the laws, sophist, the statesman. The dialogues where there is a character identified as a visitor or a stranger. I like the word stranger, but it's often translated as xenos, the visitor. And when I started to write this, I ended up focusing very much on the statesman because it was the most political dialogue, and I was writing a dissertation for a political science degree, and I found that it was one of those things that you only do in graduate school. You sort of like immerse yourself in a text, and I had learned Greek. I read the whole thing in Greek. I translated it, I took notes on every passage in a sense. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this was a marvelously constructed puzzle, a piece of writing that was actually incredibly well put together, as a kind of puzzle for interpretation, and with lots of connections to other dialogues in Plato, of course, and lots of really interesting reflections in the end. Once you figure out, I think, what Plato is trying to do, lots of really interesting reflections on the nature of expertise. And my take on it was that this is actually a dialogue that indicates. So the title of my book tries to suggest that the stranger's knowledge, that the political knowledge is a stranger to the polis. It's external to it. It cannot be reproduced within it. Necessarily needs to leave once it's embodied in laws and institutions. And there's probably a bit of an extreme position in the scholarship. So most people think of Plato as indicating or depicting here the kind of one incarnation of the philosopher king who rules in the city, even though there is no mention of the philosopher king here, and there is no, the politicos is not, in my reading of it, is quite a different figure, perhaps.
That's right. I mean, that's the stuff that I thought was really interesting about your interpretation, because I'd actually sort of naively read the Statesman myself as an expression of this authoritarianism of Plato that Karl Popper and people alleged. because there's a particular sentence which I remember grasping upon and putting in to an essay at grad school, where he says, how many people are going to have this knowledge in the state, are going to have the capacity to be a real statesman? And I think he says maybe one, or maybe maybe two or three, or maybe just one, or something like that. So you think, wow, this is a very narrow conception.
Yeah, and I think it is in some ways. Like, it's my reading of it is that precisely because it is a very narrow conception, Plato is quite clear that it is not what's going to happen. That you don't end up with a self-reproducing system of rulers who have this knowledge. At best, you achieve something like good laws that imperfectly embody the knowledge of the statesman.
Right.
And yeah, so.
No, this is all great. I actually want to go back to this in a minute, but first I actually wanted to try and situate the dialogue, or just sort of introduce the dialogue in a very simple manner. So you mentioned before that there's a number of figures in Plato who are also strangers, and they come into dialogue at certain points. If I'm right, I think this is more of a feature of the later dialogues, or we don't really know what order Plato wrote these dialogues in, but there's a sort of conventional ordering, early, middle, and late. And one of the conventional things people say about that ordering is that as you go along, the figure of Socrates changes. At first, he's sort of a less dogmatic figure. He's more questioning. In the middle period, it's often said that he becomes someone who's maybe putting forth views of Plato rather than historical Socrates. And in the final phase, you have this kind of withering away of Socrates, and he's often replaced as the dominant interlocutor by some other figure. So in this dialogue, there's actually, I think, 3 or 4 different people, like Theodorus, who were just there at the beginning. But fundamentally, it's a dialogue of 2 characters, right?
Yeah, it's between the Eleatic stranger, the visitor from Elea, and a young Socrates, who is not Socrates, not the Socrates that we know of. Socrates, historical Socrates, is in principle sitting in the audience, and he speaks briefly at the beginning of the dialogue to complement the stranger, because sort of dramatically, the conversation in the Statesman is in a series. So there's the Theaetetus, where Socrates, the historical Socrates, examines Theaetetus on the question of knowledge, right? In front of an audience consisting of Theodorus, a mathematician, and the younger Socrates. And then there is the sophist, in which Socrates sits in the audience as the visitor, the stranger from Elea, discusses the sophist with Theaetetus, as Theodorus and the younger Socrates sit there. And then there's the statesman. And there's a kind of implicit sequence, right? That they promise to speak of sophist, statesman, and philosopher, but there is no philosopher dialogue. And in terms of the dramatic sequence, it would have made sense that it would have ended with Socrates examining Socrates on the question of the philosopher. But of course, we don't have the dialogue. And as with many things in Plato, it's easy to speculate. Did he plan to write it? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Maybe he just hinted at it as a sort of like ineffable, impossible to put in writing dialogue. Or maybe it's a bit of a Platonic joke that there's going to be like, well, who's the philosopher? It's Socrates speaking to himself, right? It's a dialogue within, as Hannah Arendt put it, dialogue of thinking, speaking with myself inside. But the way that it's set up dramatically, the philosopher and the statesman are in principle different. They're 3 different figures, and that's sort of stated fairly explicitly at the beginning.
And so one of the things, again, if I recollect correctly, that they're talking about, the Eleatic stranger and younger Socrates, is a classic Socratic topic, which is a definition. So what is the statesman? And the way they go about this is quite sort of Baroque. It's this method of division.
Yeah, no, it's
Can you talk a little bit
actually,
about, so what's the method of division, and what role do you think it plays in this dialogue?
yeah, I mean, the method of division is essentially they start with a big, what is a statesman? The statement is in this class of beings, and then they make a division. They say, well, this class of beings can be separated into, what's the earliest thing? Remember what I have a figure here.
It's kind of like playing 20 questions, isn't it? It's kind of
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Are you
So,
a mineral or an animal?
yeah, exactly like that. There are a number of divisions in the dialogue. In my book, I claim that they kind of represent one continuous division. I'm less sure of that now.
Yeah.
Just trying to find a figure.
Yeah, I remember you have some very good diagrams of the division.
Oh, here it is. So they start with the idea that the statesman has some form of knowledge or expertise, and they say, well, it can be either practical or theoretical. And then they decide that it's a theoretical form of knowledge, and then they question is whether it's what they call critical or commanding or directive some way. And so they go down this, and there's a bit of a joke as they go further down. They end up with the statesman as ruling concern with ensouled beings that are tame, require collective care, who are land dwelling, that use feet for locomotion, that lack horns, that are non-interbreeding, or have split hooves, i.e. toes, that are two-footed, and that require human care rather than divine care. And there's clearly something bizarre, Baroque about this. I mentioned here. Let me find the sort of.
You reminded me of the the story about Plato defining man as a featherless biped.
It's
then the story of Diogenes the Cynic going to the academy and throwing a plucked chicken at Plato as he was lecturing, and saying,
yes,
this is Plato's man.
Yeah.
Obviously in a later source, but I always like to tell that story to my students.
Yeah. So and in fact that I think that there's an actual reference. Here's Plato's man. And there's clearly something going on here that we're meant to notice. This is in some ways a ridiculous definition. And part of what I argue in the book is that this sort of shows, so something has gone wrong with the definition. We are presented as what is presented as the essence of human beings is not their rationality, but their animality. We're not presented as beings who can rule themselves. We are presented as beings with certain particular bodies. And that leads directly into sort of the great myth of the statesman, where the kind of the consequences of this view are worked out. What would it mean to say that the statesman rules over beings who do not have rationality, who cannot rule themselves, and to put things a little bit more extremely than perhaps I do in the book, is that, but what you get is the world in reverse, right? You get gods who rule over animals who actually come from the earth and they live lives that are in reverse from what we normally have. So
Right, so
I think actually I just sort of read Plato as a kind of humorous writer in some ways.
Yeah,
Like he's making very elaborate jokes, and perhaps it's my particular sense of humor that I find this funny.
yeah. I mean, he's
Like
writing science fiction in a sense. I think we should read it like that. It's kind of like these mythoi are kind of cool stories that draw us in and reveal something about human nature or the nature of politics or whatever. But we should just back up again because people are going to hear us talking about the world in reverse and
mhm,
human lives in reverse and think we've gone completely bonkers. So Plato in his dialogues often has these myths. The Greek word mythos can mean a story, or it can also have the sense of our word myth. And there
mhm,
are several of these. Protagoras has one near the beginning, Plato's Protagoras, and the Republic has one at the end, and the Gorgias has a famous one at the end. So this is another
mhm.
one of those in the
Yeah.
Statesman. So let's just can you just say so what actually happens in this myth to the extent that
Um,
there's any consensus on that?
well, there isn't a lot of consensus on it, and the myth is um, the myth isn't entirely clear. I have a very strong view that I defend in the myth in my chapter. Um, um, I don't think the scholarship has reached any consensus even as to how many periods the myth depicts or where what happens in each period. There's relative, like the majority view is that the myth depicts a kind of cycle in the cosmos, and the majority view suggests that there are two periods, although people don't necessarily agree about exactly what happens in each period. There's a minority view that says that the myth depicts a cosmos in which there are three periods. Now, in the book, you probably don't want to get into the sort of the scholarly disputes about this, but in the book, I argue that this is totally wrong. There can't be three periods; there have to be two for a variety of reasons.
No, I
But
think I agree with you. I think there's supposed to be two, right? So
yeah.
and what are they? So first, it's the
So they're conventionally denoted as sort of the age of Cronus and the age of Zeus, but it's presented as a cyclical movement. This is something that happens like it's a repeated pattern. In the age of Cronus, the god rules the cosmos and turns it. It's a kind of geometrical metaphor. I actually think there's something like uh, the metaphor of the let me see if I can show you an image which I have in the book. The spinning. I'm not sure if that's very visible.
all right.
Yeah, this is from the British Museum.
Okay.
There's a spinning woolen thread, and the spinning of the thread, puts it in order, creates the thread, and if it spins in the other direction, it will unspin, fall into disorder. I think that's sort of the basic guiding metaphor of the myth. As we see later, there's a discussion of weaving, and spinning plays a part in it. So they're kind of textile metaphors woven throughout the dialogue. And so in the first age of the cosmos, the age of Kronos, the god weaves the cosmos, and then once it's woven, in a sense, the god lets it go and it spins in the other direction and it unweaves itself. And at the point where it's about to fall apart entirely, the god takes it on again and weaves it. So that's a basic sort of big picture view of this. But then the myth actually has all kinds of complex resonances. So there's a story about I can't remember all. My memory is not what it used to be. But there are three sources. The sources of the quarrel between Atreus and Thyestes, the Golden Age and the Age of Kronos, and the story of the sort of earthborn human beings. And they're presented in a complicated way, so it's not always clear what's going on. But my sense is that in the first period where the world is ruled by the god, it's woven by the gods themselves, or sort of avatars of the one God who rules the cosmos, who weaves it together, are the rulers of human beings. So, and this is meant to suggest this is what would it be like, what it would be like if we were as described in the first division. If this was the politically relevant characteristic of human beings, if somebody else had all the rationality, all the knowledge, and all that was left to us was to be fed, basically, was to be nurtured in the sense of like, cattle, right? So we would be like cattle in the hands of the gods. But that's only possible if the statesman were a divine being who is the shepherd of men. So there's an implicit critique of the shepherd metaphor. It's not just implicit, it's actually explicit. They kind of set it aside. And there's a discussion then of what happens when the cosmos has reached its, when it's the right time for the God to let go of the cosmos. And I think this is kind of important because it suggests to me, like, I interpret the dialogue as kind of very complex structure of metaphors and literary resonances and so on. And I think that what Plato is suggesting in the myth is that just as the God lets go of the cosmos, so the statesman in the city has to let go of the city. He weaves the order of the city, but has to let go. And in the myth, what happens is, there's a period of destruction, and humans are left to rule themselves. They can no longer rely on the gods to shepherd them. They have to rely on the arts. And there's a discussion about how the arts are somehow given by the sort of the gifts of the gods in some sense, and how we remember, how we sort of try to hold on to the order that was part of the first stage of the cosmos. Right? So I think it's a really neat, complex, like science fiction story, as you said, like it, and it's also literarily like interesting. Like there are all these like little bits and pieces that come together, and I can't claim that I think we've solved the riddle or anything like that. But it is a bit of a riddle. Like it's presented as something you have to work with. With a lot of the of Plato's later dialogues, I think what's really striking about them and what really got me interested into them is that they're not books. They're books that make you work. They're books that make you like figure out like, why is this nonsense here? Like, and yet and you could pass it by, and there are certain interpretations that say, well, it's just nonsense.
Yeah, but I mean, I think one of the things he was trying to do was with the whole dialogue form was to, and he says this more or less explicitly in various parts of his work, was to kind of reinstall orality, or to sort of do things through script that you could normally only do through talking to people in the agora, because the ideal was these conversations that Socrates had. So the dialogue form is meant to be a way of reproducing philosophical dialogue. And so I think these little myths as well, the way that they draw you in, it's meant to be kind of participatory, I suppose.
Yeah. No, and I think it is meant in that way.
But anyway, I think that the main thing that we get out of the myth, I think, emerges quite clearly, as you say, that there's this suggestion that the way humans are now is that we aren't beings that just have sort of demigods or sub-gods acting as direct shepherds over us and ruling our lives. And because of that, there's the necessity for politics. We have to learn how to live in polis, city-states or human communities. So that if you stop there, that sounds like it's kind of going the direction of the myth of Protagoras in his great speech, that we're all equally endowed with justice and shame by the gods, so that we can form human communities. And you get arguably quite a kind of democratic vision. So is that where Plato's going here? And if it is, then why do you need a statesman anyway? What's the role of the statesman in this?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite quite the way he's going. I mean, he hasn't accepted the Pythagoras idea that we're all equally endowed with justice and so on. And the rest of the dialogue really does suggest that there is something that is, strictly political knowledge. That there's a knowledge of the statesman that's not reducible to our sense of justice or something that we're all equally endowed with. So there is that sort of elitist, anti-democratic character to the rest of the dialogue. But on the other hand, I think what the dialogue does show is that as it moves through this the longer divisions that follow the myth, and as it moves into trying to figure out what this knowledge actually consists in, its role becomes increasingly limited. Like, there's a lot of knowledge that we use in politics that is not a knowledge of the statesman. Right? All the way up to the knowledge of war and peace, the general, the rhetorician, the judge. There are all kinds of forms of knowledge that are necessary for the polis, that are necessary to the order of the city, that are not the knowledge of the statesman. So I take it that, again, there's a kind of fractal structure to this, like just as the god lets go of the cosmos, but provides an order that we must remember, so the statesman lets go of the polis, but provides an order in the form of law that we must remember and hold on to, even though it's highly imperfect, because we don't have that knowledge. So even though it's not a democratic, I mean, you can't accuse Plato of being a supporter of democracy in that sense. I think there is a recognition that political life cannot depend on having this sort of the strict political knowledge. We cannot depend on, at any level, on either divine statesmen or even sort of highly competent statesmen, human statesmen. And in some ways, this is a regretful necessity for Plato. It's a second best. We might not think it's a second best, but for Plato, it definitely is a second best. And the second best is where we're stuck.
Okay, and so is the first best the vision that we get in the Republic? Because we can contrast what Plato writes presumably earlier in the Republic, and it seems like the theory there is that you train these philosopher kings in virtue, and you train them also in intellectual pursuits, especially mathematics and geometry and things like that, so that they can then glimpse the form of the good. Because you remember Plato, I mean, you know this, but just people watching, Plato has this metaphysics, universals here in these forms that are in some kind of other dimension, and things partake of the forms, and the form of something is it's absolute. And so once you have this highfalutin education and you make it through all these examinations or the whole process, whatever it is, and you grasp the form of the good and the noble, then you have the knowledge which is requisite for ruling, and also ruling in a kind of non-corrupt manner, that it won't sort of tempt you to sort of just take over everything once you've gotten this absolute power. So that if that's more or less the vision of the Republic, this is something quite different, right? Because you don't have this the whole setup of education. You don't have a philosopher king. It's something a bit more at arm's length than that, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of, I mean, I do speculate a little bit about the relationship between the Republic and statesmen, and I have to say I'm not entirely sure what is the ultimate. I mean, there's something opaque about Plato's dialogues at the end of the day, even though there are many things that we know about it, that we can interpret. I am not sure, where does he come down on this? It does seem reasonable to think that what the Republic does is suggest that if you're going to have people who have knowledge to rule, you actually need to come up with an education system where these people are self-reproducing. Whereas in the statesman, that's totally absent, right? Like the statesman appears as a kind of freak of nature. Like there's no discussion of how you would produce this knowledge. Where would you get it, right? It's just a kind of analytical exercise. If you wanted to have a well-ordered city, you need to have this knowledge, which has these characteristics, but there's no discussion about how it would be produced or reproduced. And a lot of the dialogue suggests that it just doesn't happen. Like, I make some analogies to the laws later in the book. And I think in the laws, the character of the Athenian stranger, which some people have associated with Plato himself. I don't think that's necessarily right, but that's a possibility. Is that the Athenian stranger is presented as a kind of strange fruit of Athens. So Athens didn't set out to produce somebody who had the knowledge of legislation. It didn't set out to produce the Athenian stranger. It just happened to allow it, right? So it's not a systematic outgrowth of a self-reproducing system. So you do get people like this from time to time, but it's not something you can count on. And the Athenian stranger seems to himself agree with that, like because the code of laws that he presents in the laws does not have a provision for reproducing his own role. It's not like the education of the citizens of Magnesia will lead to the production of philosopher kings. It produces, guardians of people with some basic knowledge, but it can't produce people like him. And I think it's quite a striking admission on Plato's part that perhaps there is this knowledge, but it's like in the Protagoras, which you mentioned, isn't the question, if I remember correctly, about whether virtue can be taught, right? And Socrates falls into the camp of those who say, like, it's just sort of he ended in a kind of position where maybe virtue cannot be taught, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Political virtue can't be taught for Socrates. That's his initial complaint about Protagoras, because he asks the enthusiastic young student, Protagoras, what is it that Protagoras actually teaches? And then he gets the chance to ask Protagoras that directly. And he says, well, I guess I think Socrates puts those words into his mouth, but what he's answered is effectively political arete, so political virtue, or techne, political skill. And Socrates says, well, that's not something that can be taught. I think
and I think by the laws, which is conventionally thought to be the last dialogue Plato wrote, there's a kind of acknowledgement of that if there is this political knowledge of the statesman that's required for the formation of the cities, it can't be taught in a systematic way. So you can't have the guardians of the Republic and the philosopher kings of the Republic systematically producing people
I think
with the knowledge required to rule.
I mean, as you know, the laws especially, a lot of people think, well, this is something of a step down from the Republic. Magnesia is a sort of more moderate vision than Callipolis. I mean, even that's disputed, but I think a lot of people would say that. And I do think what you see in the laws with the design of Magnesia is much more attention to things like civic subdivisions and choruses and citizen education. So it's almost as if he's sort of accepted this to some extent. There's still nocturnal councils and things like that. So there is still obviously a place for knowledgeable, expert elites in Plato's vision, but he's ceded a lot of ground to the idea that actually, which is something I think most sort of polis-dwelling ancient Greeks would have thought, that polis, city-states themselves, are sort of part of your upbringing. When they talked about constitutions, sometimes you read these ancient works on the constitutions of certain city-states, and a lot of it is about upbringing and formation and education. So they thought of these things quite naturally as going together. So I think what you seem to be arguing to me is something. It's almost like the statesman in this dialogue is like a constitutional founder in the order of sort of Cleisthenes or various other historic constitutional founders that we have in ancient Greece.
Yeah, but Plato I think that's totally right. It's what I end up saying. But I think Plato is coming at it from the perspective, like, in the Republic, he imagines a system to produce these people. He imagines a culture or an educational system that can produce such people. But in the statement, that's absent, and in the laws, it's sort of acknowledged implicitly that you can't have it. Like even if you have a code of laws, you don't get to produce people with this knowledge. If it happens sort of by freak accident in a place like Athens. Right? There's a community of other people, free speech of various kinds and so on. So it's in a way a kind of backhanded compliment to Athens. It allowed people like Socrates and Plato to actually exist and thrive, even if they disagreed with Athenian democracy. But yeah, so I agree that there's this whole tradition of thinking of like education and the socialization or the culture that produces certain kinds of characters and elites and so on. And Plato is trying to grapple with that. Like if you define political knowledge in the right kind of way, maybe there's no way to produce it. There's no way to get to it.
Okay, I guess I want to sort of segue to some modern stuff as well. Otherwise, this will be the ancient and ancient
sure.
episode.
Ancient and ancient.
It's kind of easy though, because I mean, there's so much in the way that Plato thinks about politics. I mean, at least in the Republic. And as we say, he's sort of maybe stepped down a bit from that by the time of Laws, and maybe by the time of the Statesman as well. But this whole idea of episteme, I mean, you talk about episteme and knowledge a lot in your book. And I mean, at his most bold, I really think that he does think that once you achieve this kind of political knowledge, that's what's required to rule, and really, and that's the ideal for him. Really, I mean, that's the best way of thinking about it. Is that we really should have a system in an ideal world in which there are people who just know how to do politics, and they can kind of do it on behalf of everybody else. So I guess the question is just, how does this sort of help you think about expertise in the modern world? And because there have been some pretty recent debates about this idea that we should have an epistocracy. I think this is Jason Brennan's term, where we have more knowledgeable people who have a bit more of a say in politics, because some people are just information poor. And I don't want to mock this view, because actually you can do surveys and stuff, and some people do know more than others. So what do you think about this idea in the modern world that some people should have?
Yeah, I think Plato actually thought of it in a fairly different way that somebody like Jason Brennan would have thought of it. Like, I think what you learn from the Statesman is that there's a lot of technical knowledge that is not political knowledge. Like, political knowledge is pretty very specific thing. It doesn't have anything to do with sort of being well or poorly informed about I don't know, the details of our constitutional arrangement or something. It's and if you look at the Republic, the earlier vision, perhaps it's very specific what the philosopher king needs to know. Needs to know the good, the form of the good. It's moral knowledge, really, before everything else. And I think what the Statesman did in the dialogue is sort of think about how you get the form of the things like the good and so on. How would you actually use that to make judgments about particular cases? And it's a big problem, right? So you might think, well, maybe somebody knows in general, abstractly, some what the right thing to do is. But how would you actually make a determination of the particular, of the world of change, right? Where politics is constantly changing, there always new things. And at the end of the day, I think Plato's answer is quite profound. That, if you think of political knowledge in this way, it's a knowledge of the kairos, the appropriate thing, and it's not a knowledge of, say, how to wage war or so on. It's a knowledge of the time to wage war or not. Or it's not a knowledge of particulars of a legal case. It's a knowledge of the appropriateness of legal resolution and so on.
Yeah, if you, I think that's right. I think he did have that conception. Although if you push on that too far, then the conception of Platonic episteme kind of collapses into mere prudentia or kind of phronesis, I suppose. Just an idea of I know what to do at the right time, and that's the kind of thing that everybody kind of thinks that about politicians, don't they? That like the prime minister should know vaguely sort of what to do at time X.
Yeah.
What you were saying at the beginning, I mean, I think Plato is a bit more ambitious than that.
He's trying to connect those two.
Knowledge. And in that sense, I often think that, again, when I'm trying to talk to the students about the Republic, in a way, his vision is almost a theocratic one. It's one where there are these sort of wise people. I mean, he says that you can be a woman too, actually. One of the only really progressive bits in Plato. So there's this sort of cast of wise ones who can rule. And so what you should think of as, I suppose, something like the Dalai Lama or monks or something like that, and an ideal vision of them as they are actually sincere and doing a good job.
No, and I think like when we transpose it to the modern world, I think there's something to be said for the epistocratic argument that politics requires some knowledge. It's a bit more complicated to say what are the institutional forms that best exploit that knowledge. And there's a sort of lively debate with sort of the epistemic Democrats who argue that democracy best allows people to sort of pool the diverse perspectives, diverse forms of knowledge, and so on into a better decision by whatever metric you want. And the sort of the more aristocratic perspective that says, well, there are some decisions where limiting the inputs is actually probably better and it results in better outcomes somehow. I think at the level of the system, of the system as a whole, I think the sort of the epistemic Democrats have a better case. Like if you don't focus on a particular sort of realm of policy, say, I don't know, monetary policy or I don't know, macroeconomic stabilization or something like that. In those limited realms, there's probably a case for saying that expertise matters and limits to the inputs that you put in it probably makes some sense. But that just means I'm a kind of boring liberal Democrat here. Like I think that representative democracy is a fine system in this sense. It strikes the balance between those things in a reasonable way.
Yeah, I think you've basically said what I think more or less. Although maybe I'd put the distinction in slightly different terms. I mean, I think what I think is that clearly political questions tend to be questions that are normative or that are about what we should do, what we ought to do, where we're going to go in terms of the political community, how we identify things like that. And for questions like that, what you really need to do is aggregate people's preferences, because it's essentially, these things are essentially questions of what people's preferences are. They're not answerable by means of technical knowledge. So that's where I think the big argument with Plato is that he perceives politics itself as a kind of technical knowledge. And I share the criticism of people who say, well, that's just not the kind of thing that politics does. And there are various technical expertises, technical fields, which can touch upon those decisions. And you can consult specialist economists about what's going to happen to the economy if you leave the European Union or whatever. You can consult with expert military men about how many tanks you're going to need if you want to invade country X. But ultimately, whether you ought to do those things, those are political questions, and those are questions that should be put to everybody.
Yeah, no, but I think in a way I think that's kind of what the statesman was saying in the dialogue, like that they're all these expertises, but they're not political questions ultimately. Like a political question is a different kind of knowledge. And we could give it a kind of democratic spin in the modern world and say, well, democracy is the way we try to approximate that political knowledge. We do have generals, we do have legal experts, we do have people, economists, and so on and so forth, who deal with like limited aspects of the order of the society. Political knowledge is different. In modern terms, the best approximation to it we have found is a kind of democratic approximation, where we take some process to deliberate to a variety of perspectives and ideas about what is good or bad, and come up with a kind of some best answer somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I had in mind was something so basic that I don't even know if I want to call it knowledge. I mean, I suppose I'm with the kind of very old-fashioned Democrats who think of it as an aggregation of preferences in a kind of utilitarian scheme. And then, to me, it's almost it's too elitist already to call it knowledge, because then you're sort of judging what the aggregation of people's preferences in a certain way. But I suppose you could say, well, okay, well, even if we just run the system as an aggregation of preferences, that's how we make decisions. You could say to a democracy, hey, democracy X, we know that you're going to aggregate your preferences, and that's fine. But if you want to have a really well-run state, you should think about the following things. And there's actually a knack to this. And so I guess is that where the statesman comes in, because it's almost like a figure.
Well, I mean, I think I guess I'm a sort of Platonist at this point. Like, I do think that there will be external standards. So I'm with the epistemic Democrats here. Like we can, we can't be certain what those epistemic standards are, but we can judge the outputs of democratic process in various ways. And I think that goes to kind of the design of institutions, right? If we say, well, the democracy is an aggregation of preferences, I would still want to say, well, there are certain better and worse ways of aggregating those preferences. And a kind of a system that allows for multiple opportunities for deliberation, that has, inputs that are not unnecessarily polarized, that allows for the exchange of reasons, the sort of basic Habermasian stuff, basically, of the deliberative system, and connecting to the political system so it reaches a decision. I think you end up at a place where it's not Platonic exactly, but there is something to be said for the idea that deliberative system expresses some approximation to a correct decision in some sense. And whether or not you structure it properly makes you closer or further away from what would be a good decision. On average, over time, and so on. Not every decision is going to come out.
Yeah, I suppose. But then, how you judge what a good decision is. I mean, ultimately, it comes down to what people tend to want, right? Because you can say we have various output messages, measures, like we want to be reasonably prosperous or not dirt poor. We want to be reasonably secure, or at least not sort of regularly dominated by external enemies. And these, I think, make sense as output measures because they tend to be things. They're things that people tend to like. So, but if that's the case, then the aggregation of preferences that should track those things as well. Although I agree that you can get into these situations where, as we've seen in human history, where things go wrong. I mean, whether those things have gone wrong so often when you have a good democratic system, or more often when you have a good democratic system or an authoritarian system, is a big question. I mean, I would argue the latter. I mean, partly there's just this statistical problem that so many of the regimes of the past have been non-democratic. So it's hard to see. But as for the sort of Habermasian structure, making sure people can discuss things. I mean, I suppose I'd retreat to the position that those are the things which allow honest preferences, your actual preferences, to be aired. But then you might say, well, you're already judging, people's preferences. So
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, there's a more minimal. I think there's a more minimal view that it's aggregation of preferences. The, sort of the Schumpeterian view of democracy. It's still, there's still standards in the evaluation of that, like Schumpeter and Jaworski today basically say, well, at the end of the day, it matters because it's a peaceful way of resolving um, interest disputes. But that already assumes that peace is the thing that sets a standard that we ought to care about. And I think that's the sort of Platonic view come in. Yeah, where do you get those standards, right? Is it some theory of human nature? Is it some theory of like there has to be some external knowledge in a way, some external view. There's an internal view, but there's also the external view that allows you to judge whether or not the standards are being met. And even if we take the very minimal sort of Schumpeterian Jaworski view of democracy in terms of aggregation of preferences and so on, you still end up with questions of institutional design. Maybe some systems of aggregation of preferences are better or worse at managing those conflicts. Right? I don't know. My colleague John Frankel teaches a course on governing divided societies, and he has lots of particular discussion of the scholarship on whether or not certain constitutional arrangements are better able to head off those conflicts and so on. So even there's a kind of political knowledge involved.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to make it impossible for societies to learn from the mistakes, certainly. And there's the problem which has been around since de Tocqueville, or which has had a name since de Tocqueville, which is the the tyranny of the majority problem. I mean, the American founders were worried about that as well. I would say on the point about Schumpeter, I mean that's interesting because I mean that's basically Karl Popper's view as well. I think that he pretty much followed Schumpeter in this. That the virtue of a democratic system is that you can get rid of an elite or the section of the elite that's currently ruling if they become too corrupt or they become incompetent. You can have a view which is founded on aggregation preferences without that elitist vision. So you don't have to have that within a representative democratic framework. So, for example, the Athenians were aggregating citizen preferences, but they had a much more ample conception of who could be a magistrate. And
I do think there's something to be said, like Joe Schober's book on Athenian democracy, which and I really like. I mean, it's sort of democracy and knowledge, and he makes a really good case for the Athenians having a very excellent system for like not just aggregating preferences, but aggregating the diverse knowledge of the citizens and so on. And in a sense, I think that's sort of a epistemic democrat view, right? That the Athenians just got a better system. They embodied their knowledge of the internal knowledge of standards and values and so on in a better way than many others.
The only hesitation I have there is that there's lots of work now about the wisdom of the crowds. I mean, I suppose it's more sort of 5 or 10 years ago now, before Twitter really took off. But Helen Landemore, for example, has written about this, and there's various experiments that suggest that you get people around a table and they have diverse forms of knowledge, and that can be better at solving problems than just sort of expert-led procedure. And I think that's very promising, and I see the studies that she's looking at. I think in some ways though that argumentative tack has moved things onto a ground where the Platonists and the epistocrats are actually quite strong, because they can say, no, look, there are obviously some fields from sort of chess to brain surgery where experts just massively outperform people who are trying to people who aren't experts are trying to sort of combine their knowledge. So yes, I do think that collective action is good at solving problems in certain circumstances, but I don't think that it's the sort of strongest foundation for a defense of democracy. But anyway, I should end at this point because I just had a knock at my door.
Okay.
But and also because we've come to an hour, so I'm sorry
Okay.
we didn't get to talk about your book on non-democracy. But there's a solution to that, which is people should go and read it.
Okay.
Go and buy it. So thank you very much, Javier.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, James.
cheers.
It was great fun talking.
Bye.
Bye.